We say it's an invisible disability. These are kids that look like their neurotypical peers. However, all of the symptoms are behavioral. It looks like willful disobedience. It looks like opposition, defiance, a lazy kid, things like that. They look like they should be able to do everything that their peers do, but they really can't.
You're listening to the Connected Parenting Minute with Will and CarrieAnn Standfest. This podcast is a conversation about parenting using connection first, trauma-informed principles. Because when you lead with connection, everyone feels seen, which is the foundation to a more peaceful home. This podcast reminds you that you don't have to be a perfect parent, but we can all get a little better, one connected parenting minute at a time.
Hello, and welcome back to the Connected Parenting Minute podcast. My name is Will Standfest. I'm so glad that you've joined us. With me this evening is the lovely CarrieAnn Standfest.
Hey, everybody. We're so glad to be back recording. It's been a little bit for us.
It has. When you've got 8 children in your family, there's a little bit going on around the holidays.
Right? I mean, this is post-Christmas, post-New Year, and we may have had a little bit of sickness go through, and I got it, and it was not good.
It was rough.
All right. But, that happens, and it's okay, and there is flexibility, and thankfully, lots of time just to go ahead and try to get things together.
Yep. Well, as promised, we've been talking about this interview for a few weeks now. This week, we are on the podcast. We are playing our interview that we recorded back during the Replanted conference with Sandra Flach.
Oh my gosh, I have enjoyed so much getting to know Sandra and being able to see what she is doing because she's out in New York State, and just her family and their story and the things that they're working on out there, but just how the information that she's learned and the way that she's processed it and sharing it with others has been so amazing. I've learned so much from her in the very little time we've gotten to know her. And I so look forward to connecting with her again and again and again because she's an invaluable resource. So we're going to be talking with Sandra about FASD.
FASD.
Yeah. Can you tell us what that is, Will?
FASD is Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorders. And it's kind of an umbrella term that covers alcohol-related neurological impacts that children have when a mother has ingested alcohol during the pregnancy.
Right. So you may not know anything about this. You may know a little bit about this, but I highly encourage you to go ahead and listen to our interview because Sandra she knows so much about it. And we unpack a lot of those things in the interview. And honestly, we may not have any idea what it is or, if anybody has it. But really our hope is to just bring enlightenment and be able to help spread kind of the word about what this is and how it impacts children, how it impacts families, school systems, all of these different aspects, because it does impact our family and it is really called the invisible disability. And we'll unpack that in the interview.
So without further ado, here's our interview with Sandra Flach. Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. With us tonight is Sandra Flach. Hello, Sandra, and welcome to the Connected Parenting Minute.
Hey, Will. Great to be here.
We're very happy to have you. CarrieAnn and I got a chance to spend the weekend with you here at the Replanted conference, and so we thought we'd sit down and have a conversation talking about FASD, which is something I think a lot of our parents don't know a whole lot about. Maybe they've heard the term, they've heard fetal alcohol, they know it's not a great thing, and yet at the same time, they don't understand. And so we wanted to spend a few minutes talking about that, unpacking that, and just because, again, part of our goal here is to raise awareness.
Right. And we've shared in the past that is something that we have in our home. And so we've learned a whole bunch in the past couple of years. And again, if we hadn't heard anybody talk about it, we wouldn't know even the questions to ask. And so this affects a lot of kids that we see through foster care, through adoption, through a whole spectrum of situations. But I think that it also affects kids and we don't even realize it. And so we'll talk some more about that. But Sandra, why don't you share with us, what FASD is first off, because I think just having an understanding of it to start the conversation would be great.
Yeah. And thanks again, Will and CarrieAnn, for having me on. So FASD, Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorders, brain-based, lifelong physical disability that affects people who were prenatally exposed to alcohol. And FASD in and of itself is not a diagnosis. There's actually several diagnoses under that. It's a spectrum of disorders. So on the most extreme end of the spectrum, we would find fetal alcohol syndrome. Typically, would be where the children do present with the classic facial features that we think of when we think of FASD, and then all of the other behavioral symptoms down to where there's just some exposure. And those are the kiddos who it's really hard to diagnose and detect because we know there's something that is missing. There's like something going on, but we don't know exactly what it is, and they don't have the facial features. So there's several diagnoses under the FASD spectrum: alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder, partial fetal alcohol syndrome, and so on. But all of it comes from a baby being exposed to alcohol in the womb.
Okay. And you talk about those facial features. Like, I know what that is because I've been through so many trainings with that. But can you explain to our listeners what those are?
Yeah. So the facial features include a flat philtrum, which is that space between the bottom of your nose and the top of your upper lip, where we tend to have that little groove. With fetal alcohol syndrome, that tends to be flat in the individual, a thin upper lip, sort of a flat looking face, could be an underdeveloped jaw, typically smaller head circumference, especially at birth. And then the smaller, like the slits for the eye opening tend to be a little bit smaller. But oftentimes you don't really understand what that is. Like most people would not recognize, oh, that person has FASD, or they wouldn't think that. And only about 10% of the population of people with FASD present with those facial features.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a huge piece to recognize. A lot of times you'll see people in these adoption groups saying, here's a picture of my kiddo. Do they have FASD? And that's not how we diagnose that.
Yeah. And that's now my boys. I have two sons diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. They're 19 and 21 now. They do have the facial features. So they have the diagnosis of fetal alcohol syndrome. And unfortunately, a lot of doctors do rely on the facial features in order to diagnose, but then they're missing like 90% of the population that has it, because they're relying on those facial features. And it's like birth mom had been drinking between days like 15 and 18 of gestation for the facial features to be affected.
And that's typically before mothers even know that they're pregnant.
Yes.
Right. I remember hearing that and just being absolutely flabbergasted that it was in that small period of time in the fetus's development. Okay. Wow. It does blow your mind when you really think about it. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Sandra, and like a little bit about your story? Because I just find it so fascinating and I'd love to share that.
So my husband and I have 8 children, 3 biological. They're all grown and out of the house. And then we did a kinship adoption back in the olden days of 1999. We had an 8-year-old relative who came to live with us. We had custody of her, eventually did adopt her. She's now 34. And then a few years after she came, we felt led to do an international adoption. So we adopted 4 siblings from Ukraine. And it's the youngest 2 of that group that has the diagnosis of FAS. However, knowing what I know today, I highly suspect some prenatal exposure in 2 of the other children that we had adopted. But back then we didn't know, we didn't even really know about trauma and the impacts of trauma on children, because initially our daughter came through the kinship placement that kept her out of the foster care system. So we didn't even have foster parent training classes. So had none of that. So we just had to learn as we went. And, but over the years, our children began to grow. We got some training through the Empowered to Connect group, and then started our nonprofit, which is Justice for Orphans, initially as advocacy, talking with the church, trying to engage folks in the adoption and foster care space. And then eventually I have a podcast, the Adoption and Foster Care Journey podcast. Our group does Care Portal, which is a lot of folks know about that across the country. So we do that in New York State, where I'm from, the upstate New York area. And then I started talking more and more about FASD. So I do a lot of training and support group and speaking and writing on FASD.
Yeah. So getting back specifically to kiddos that have been prenatally exposed and maybe have not been diagnosed or have been diagnosed, what are some of the common struggles that you see with those particular kids in their day-to-day lives or in school or in family life?
Yeah. So it comes from the symptoms, right? We say it's an invisible disability.
Mm-hmm.
So these are kids that look like their neurotypical peers. However, all of the symptoms are behavioral. It looks like willful disobedience. It looks like opposition, defiance, a lazy kid, things like that, because they look like they should be able to do everything that their peers do, but they really can't. So the symptoms are behavioral. So a lot of it is dysmaturity, for example. So these are kids that tend to act much younger. And it's really because cognitively, developmentally, they're much younger than their biological, like their birthday age. They tend to have sensory processing challenges, slower processing pace. They process information much more slowly. So multiple step directions, lots of words being spoken to them. They miss a lot of that information. And so sometimes it seems like they know what's going on, but they don't really know what's going on. So a lot of language and communication problems, abstract concepts are difficult, money, math, time, things like that. Memory, short-term memory challenges, and a lot of executive function challenges. So an executive function is responsible for controlling impulses, making decisions, short-term memory, self-regulation, regulating emotions, focus, attention, things like that. So again, people aren't sure exactly what's going on. It's a lot of the same symptoms as trauma. So I have a lot of families who will say, how do I know? How do I know if it's trauma? How do I know if it's prenatal exposure? Which is it? And I always say, it's both all at the same time. And sometimes we can't comb through it and figure out which is which. But if you suspect prenatal exposure in any way, expect it to be that, because a lot of times we don't know. But whether it's just trauma, whether it's prenatal exposure, whether it's some other brain difference, remembering that it's the brain that's controlling the behaviors, and the individual needs to be supported and accommodated so that they can be successful, because it really is an invisible disability.
And that's so hard because, like you said, a lot of the disability presents as behaviors, right? And so a lot of times we have a kiddo who's been diagnosed with FAS, and she does okay in school, but she's got a lot of coping skills, right? She knows how to blend in. She knows how to kind of laugh along and things like that, because slower processing speed is something she struggles with. And you will have a teacher, explain the whole thing to her, and you could ask her again 5 minutes later, and she has no idea what they talked about.
Yep.
And explaining that to the school and advocating for her that, look, listen, I know she looks normal and she fits in, but you gotta send just send a little note home, because she is going to struggle to recall that.
We've had such a great fall traveling and speaking at conferences. We're excited to announce our first conference of 2025. Join us at the Conference in Kansas City, February 21st through 22nd, again in 2025. Join us for real encouragement for foster and adoptive parents. Registration can be found at realencouragement.org. That's realencouragement.org. And if you're interested in having us speak at your event, contact us at info@connectedparentingminute.com. We'd be happy to work with you.
And now back to the show.
Right? I mean, as you're reading through that list and as you're sharing all these different symptoms that we see in some of our kiddos, I feel so validated because sometimes there's an element where I go, oh my goodness, what am I not doing right to help her learn or help our kids learn these things, these skills that they need to do? Because, it's very easy to look at these and go, how are they going to function when they're adults? How are they going to function in the real world? But I think that piece of recognizing it, acknowledging it, being able to put accommodations in place as they grow and help them learn to strategies. There is hope though.
Yes.
I mean, you talked about this as being a permanent lifelong, effects our kids forever, essentially. But where is the hope in some of this?
The hope in this is that, especially the sooner that parents can learn about it and understand that this is a child with a brain that works differently. Alcohol changes the structure and function of the brain as it's developing. So understanding that it's not willful disobedience, it's not something that you can discipline or consequence to correct, right? Because that's not going to work with these kiddos, and coming alongside them and understanding where it's coming from and trying to figure out, like you gave the example of that slow processing pace, right? Understanding that helps us to know that, okay, so to help this kiddo, we're going to give less verbal instructions. We're going to use less words. We're going to give one step direction at a time. Maybe for older kids, we can write it down, give them a list rather than kind of that verbal assault of all of these words coming at them. Give them extra time to answer, right? So when we do those things, the child can do much better at home, at school, across environments. Because when we don't, if it's not recognized, all of these primary symptoms over time, we do see secondary symptoms develop. And that's things like, they get very frustrated, a lot of fatigue. They tend to want to sleep a lot, self-isolate, anxiety, depression, problems at home, problems at school. And all of that is really secondary because the child is frustrated all the time because they're not understood. They look like they should be able to do everything. They can't do everything. And then they're in trouble all the time because they're not doing everything. So really, we have to adjust our expectations. And when the child can begin to thrive and be successful, we all feel more hope. There is hope for the future for our kids. When our kids got diagnosed, my boys are now 19 and 21, like I mentioned. When they first got diagnosed at 6 and 8, the developmental pediatrician handed us a piece of paper about ADHD. They gave us a fetal alcohol syndrome diagnosis. Here's a piece of paper about ADHD. And when I went home to look online about this FAS, I saw this doom and gloom outcome. Like what we had to look forward to was jail, addiction, homelessness, suicide. That's all there was to look forward to. And that does not have to be the outcome for our kids if we begin to understand that this is a brain-based condition. It's lifelong. Yes, they can grow. Yes, they can improve in some areas and build on their strengths, but they're going to most likely need supports and services and accommodations to be successful, just like anybody else with a disability.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm thinking of all these different things. But one of the things that I wanted to address is that, we see some of this in foster care and adoption world, but there is also the situations where a birth parent, who is still parenting their kids may have had alcohol before they realized they were pregnant, or even just like, oh, it doesn't matter. And, there's a lot of shame with that. I think I belong to a couple of, Facebook groups, and they talk about it and very strict on those groups about not shaming parents, because if parents are coming and saying, hey, I noticed this about my kid, I want to help them, but I was the one who, drank, that's really hard, especially to recognize that you had something, you didn't know, or you didn't know how it would affect your kid, but it's still there. So I just want to encourage our listeners, if this sounds like you, or if this sounds like some of your kids, not to let that shame piece keep you from seeking support, seeking knowledge on this, because the only thing you can do is go forward. And there's a lot of things that play into that. All right. So we've talked a little bit about what FASD, like what that means. Where are places that parents can go or caregivers can go to learn more about this and get some support and understand better, because we don't know what we don't know.
Right, exactly. So I would say visit my website, which is justicefororphans.ny.org, and click on the training tab, and it'll take you to our FASD resources. I offer online and in-person workshops, parent coaching. We have an online support group for parents and caregivers of kiddos with FASD, whether or not they're diagnosed, because it is very hard to get a diagnosis. And my podcast as well, The Adoption and Foster Care Journey, I talk about FASD a lot. There is also the national organization on FASD, which is FASD United, is another great organization where you can learn more, and they can connect you. They have a family navigators program on their website where you can fill in some basic information and put in the state that you come from in the United States, and they'll be able to get back to you with whatever services and supports and diagnostic centers and whatnot are in your state.
Yeah. And when we talked a little bit about it's really hard to diagnose.
Yeah.
That piece, I mean, we had the resource of the adoption clinic where we live in our state. And even that was really difficult for us to get because what are some of the criteria they use to diagnose right now?
Unfortunately, doctors are still relying on maternal admission of alcohol consumption during pregnancy, which especially in adoption and foster care, you don't often get.
Mm-hmm.
And then doctors are still relying on the facial features to be present. And like we shared earlier, that only affects about 10% of the population of people who are prenatally exposed. So doctors will miss 90% of the cases if they're relying on facial features. In addition to that, doctors don't like to diagnose because of that stigma. They don't want to shame birth moms, and they don't want to label a kid with this diagnosis because of those very poor outcomes. That if you search the internet, that was all you ever found. So there is hope out there, but doctors are still hesitant to give that diagnosis.
Do you find that there's still being a lot of research done on this particular topic? And
Yes.
what are they doing? Like what is kind of up and coming or that you have seen?
Yeah, there's a lot. And a great place to go to learn more about all of the research that's being done is that FASD United. They have on their website all of links to all of that research that's being done. And I have seen just recently, they're doing research all the time. They're studying even genetics and epigenetics because there is a connection. They're finding that with birth dads, if they had been drinking at any time, it changes cells. Alcohol alters and changes cells. Not that would cause FASD, but they're finding genetically it is having an effect. So they're studying epigenetics. There's been studies on co-concurring health conditions. So there are, and you can actually search online FASD and 428 comorbidities, right? So they've done some research and discovered that among the population of people with FASD, there's a high prevalence of other health conditions, things like hearing, vision problems, autoimmune disorders, heart defects, diabetes, some of the other things, musculoskeletal effects. Like, for example, my son, when he was 3, one of my sons with FAS, when we adopted him at 3, he had severe scoliosis. So he has, in addition to that, just a very wonky skeletal system, right? And he's got a very small stature. So he's 21 years old and he weighs 97 pounds and is 5'1". So, his orthopedic surgeon was like, I don't know anything about FASD. I just know he has scoliosis. And I'm like, okay, but I highly suspect that birth mom was drinking while his spinal column was being formed, while his skeletal system was being formed. So alcohol can affect all kinds of things in utero. Even learning that, because a lot of times we'll talk to families, and as I start sharing some of those things, they start realizing my child with FASD has these other health conditions. So a lot of research also being done on that. So for the latest on everything, because there's so many different things that are being researched, FASD United is a great place to go.
That's fantastic.
So another thought I had too is for people out there where they don't, their children don't have FASD and they're just kind of learning about this for the first time. How would you recommend to them to interact with families that are supporting kiddos that have FASD? Like, what is a way that they can help those families feel more seen or more supported or help encourage or really see those kids and meet them where they're at?
Yeah, that's a hard one because just like our kids with trauma and a lot of the symptoms of trauma and the symptoms of FASD overlap, parents who have just neurotypical biological children don't really get our kids, right? They don't understand that our kids, these behaviors are because they were exposed to trauma. These behaviors are because their brains work differently because of the trauma or because of prenatal exposure. So definitely non-judgmental, and I've heard all kinds of things, as I'm sure you have, like that kid just needs to be spanked, or that kid just needs to be disciplined, or you're not strict enough, or you're letting them get away with too much, or they're just lazy, or, so on and so forth. So getting educated yourself a little bit so that you can understand that this is, neurodiversity. Everybody's brain works differently. And children with trauma, children with prenatal exposure, they have a brain difference, and we need to take that into consideration, just like we would somebody with any kind of a disability. So grace, non-judgmental, and learn so you can support, because this is a very hard journey for parents who are parenting kids with trauma and prenatal exposure. So give them a break, let them go out for a cup of coffee by themselves. You can help out that way.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. So let's go back over again where people can find you, if they want more information, how to reach out and how to connect with you and some of the resources you offer.
Yeah. So for, again, the podcast is the Adoption and Foster Care Journey podcast. For all this, to sign up for any of my online training, the support group, which is called Hope for the FASD Journey Support Group, you would go to our website, justicefororphans.ny.org. I also have my personal website where I blog about this is sandraflach.com. And also I'm on Facebook and Instagram as well, if you want to find me there.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you for being with us tonight, Sandra. And
it's been a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you for taking the time.
Oh, thank you for asking. And thank you for letting me hang out with you this weekend at Replanted.
all right. Well, that was a very fun, very enjoyable interview with Sandra Flach.
I enjoyed that so much, and I'm so grateful we got an opportunity to talk to her.
So hopefully you guys have learned a little bit more about FASD, about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and how that impacts kiddos and families around you. And you can be a little more aware of what families around you might be experiencing.
And there's always lots of resources on finding out more. And hopefully we'll be able to continue to advocate for our kiddos with this disability.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it impacts a lot more people than I think we realize. And again, if you want to hear more from Sandra Flach, you can go to justicefororphansny.org. That's justice for FOR orphans, NY as in New York.org. And that's the website for her foundation, Justice for Orphans, as well as the Adoption Foster Care Journey podcast, which you can find on any podcast platform.
Speaking of her podcast, she actually recently interviewed us for one of her upcoming podcasts. So if you want to hear more about our story and hear a fun conversation between us, I would definitely check that out. We'll definitely link to it when it is released.
Yeah, absolutely. It was fun to kind of unpack our journey through foster care and adoption. And if you're curious to hear more about that, please check out her episode when that gets released here in a few weeks. So once again, thank you for tuning into the podcast. If you've enjoyed or gotten value from this, please share it with your friends. The best thing you can do for us is help other people to hear the message that we're trying to share, to spread awareness and help encourage other parents out there. And before we go, we always want to remind you,
you don't have to be a perfect parent,
but we can all get a little bit better, one connected parenting minute at a time.
Thank you so much for listening to my mom and dad's podcast. I hope you feel really inspired today, and remember to subscribe for the next episode.
For more parenting tips or to connect with us, check out the Connected Parenting Minute on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Or you can send us an email using connectedparentingminute@gmail.com.